So as the members of the panel are getting settled, if you have questions or comments, if you could approach the microphones, that would be great. And I think there's someone in charge of collecting the questions from our webinar folks too.
Good afternoon. As mentioned, I have a couple questions here from people viewing this online. The first is directed toward Dr. Vasbinder. And it says you mentioned exercise of 15 minutes for the dogs. And the question relates to, is that 15 minutes per day for all dogs, or is that somewhere or somehow changed if the dogs are in a social setting and they're getting exercise with their other cage mates?
So that actually is 15 minutes of social exercise per dog. Now recognize that some of the dogs are not tolerant to a social exercise environment. There's actually a smaller space for those dogs that are exercised individually. And I have to be honest with the person asking this question that we ended out having issues with paying our staff on the weekends and holidays for exercise. And I have to tell you, I don't think they need the exercise less. It was just what transpired for our particular program. But a minimum of 15 minutes. And usually when the staff get the dogs in there, it takes a while to bring them in and bring them out. So it's variable, but yeah, we work towards 15 minutes per dog per day with social interaction. And I was going to mention one more thing. Not all exercise space is created equal. You know, think about some exercise space I've seen, like in a 10 by 10 room. Can an animal truly change gait? That's the question you have to ask. So really making an exercise space appropriate. My preference is a very long exercise space that dogs can truly run, and they will if they're allowed.
Okay, thank you. The second question goes to the panel. It says modern veterinary skills and use of appropriate therapeutics need to be incorporated in discussions about performance standards. What are the panel's thoughts on instituting a requirement for veterinarians to maintain a current licensure to practice and prescribe drugs in their working jurisdiction? These seem to be some of the best questions from online.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at that. For those of us who are veterinarians in the room, you realize that over the last year or so, we've had to deal with some issues, some interesting issues regarding licensure and DEA licensure, specifically in using drugs in the field. Gladly, that has come to a kind of a neat resolution, and I think we're in a really good place with that right now. Now, I have to put a little disclaimer in. When I was a federal veterinary medical officer, which I no longer am, you know, the government recognized my Georgia licensure and my Colorado licensure as good enough to practice on federal lands. And we all maintained our licensure as current and active and got our CE and held that to a high standard. Now, those were not the federal requirements. Those were our professional choices. And so I guess in a way that was kind of a personal, professional, or performance standard that we chose to employ. I guess I'm not sure that answers the question, but so I'm agreeing with that that's a priority and that's a personal choice that I made and my colleagues made.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bob Disco from the University of Michigan. So our program is very similar to Dr. Lipman's. We have a residency program. We try and tackle some of these performance standard evaluations internally. And one of the questions that's come up a couple of times in talking with other colleagues and people who are visiting is that how often do you need to repeat these types of studies? And I guess I would direct this at John, but I'd like to hear from everybody, including the morning panel. You know, does that institution that did the dog study need to repeat that at some point in time? I would understand if like the caging changed or something changed, but we're sort of seeming to get a little bit of a hit. Like, well, if you looked at that 4 years ago, you have to look at it again. Or if you published that in 2005, you got to do that again. And I'm trying to get a sense of what parameters dictate when that has to happen.
So I could answer that. I think that in programs, often there's drift. And, you know, drift in practice, drift in perception, and there's a need to reevaluate programs. And so one of the ways that we've addressed that at GSK is actually to bring in consultants to look at our programs, bring in outside eyes. And it was actually a commitment that came out of we created the dog we wills that then got transpired to what I showed you today. But the dog we wills still stand, really. And one of the dog we wills was we will form an advisory panel. And that's actually transpired as bringing in consultants to look at our program. And we don't have a set time that we do that, but it seems that there's a need for reevaluation about every 3 or 4 years. We bring someone in just to put outside eyes on our program, especially for dogs, primates, rodents.
But Marion, are they specifically looking at the performance standards that you've set up in those species? Is that one of the targets that you're having them look at?
Yeah, they look at they'll look at handling techniques. They'll look at the program of veterinary care. They'll look at caging and enrichment environments, enrichment devices for primates, the holistic program.
From the ALAC perspective, well, I warned you that I like to answer questions with questions.
Yeah.
And so we would say, what is your strategy for periodic reevaluation of these standards? With the only expectation on our part, because we don't know what the answer to that question is. How often should that dog housing performance standard be reevaluated? We will simply ask you that question with the expectation that you recognize that some periodicity is appropriate. And there's clearly a priority of practices that you might establish when looking at periodicity. If some are tricky and involve, issues with humane endpoints or the potential for pain and distress, we would naturally expect to see a much more frequent review of that. At my former institution, we had an animal care and use committee that did this monthly for one particular study that wanted to do some pretty unique things with infectious disease studies. So a monthly re-review. It was pretty rigorous. Versus something that's a lot more innocuous might be fairly infrequent because the practice doesn't change. It's been shown to be effective. So we don't dictate that because we don't want this to be any more onerous than it already is. And I'll ask maybe some of my other colleagues at ALAC, we have a lot of council members in the room and other site visitors to chime in if I fail to mention something.
Thank you.
So I was intrigued by the study that you shared with us about the fact when they sanitized the cages and eliminated all the bacteria. And my question is there enough awareness that this particularly can change the gut microbiota in the host and therefore the results are different, or are these two groups working in different directions? Like, as you know, of course, the gut microbiota has a huge effect on outcomes of diseases and so forth. So if eliminating this and changing the model completely, are people aware of this that are sanitizing the cages? Yeah, anybody who can, please.
I want to answer if I don't have to. Yeah, my example was purely hypothetical, but I lifted language directly from the guide that said that potentially pathogenic viruses, bacteria, and other organisms be reduced or eliminated. So that standard is in the guide, and if one takes that to develop their own precise definition of a clean cage, then that's worthy of consideration. Might it impact the microbiology of the gut?
Yeah,
Sure, undoubtedly. And if there are studies in which the cage environment is critical to establish the microbiota, then you might really need to consider a unique institutional or study-specific precise definition of that cage. The guide authors, I suspect, had in mind that the reason we sanitize cages is to eliminate, or for biosecurity, to keep a precise definition known in the animal colonies themselves. And a good way to do that is to keep cages clean at an appropriate interval. So pathogen control, not so much altering the gut microflora, although you raise a very good point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Judy MacArthur-Clarke here again. My question is around the conflict, when there's a conflict between engineering standards and performance standards. And we've heard a couple of examples of that. Bart and John both described where there was a conflict and how that was addressed. But thinking about the addressing of the conflict, it did seem to me, and bearing in mind what I said earlier about my sense is that engineering standards are the welfare safety net, that's the term I used. They're kind of like the lowest, and I think people generally have agreed with that, they're minimum standards. And what I was hearing was that the conflict was more around the dilemma of single housing animals as opposed to social housing, rather than tackling the fundamental question of, is the engineering standard wrong? So was it the wrong standard for the dogs and therefore it was okay to house the dogs in that way? Or was it the wrong standard for the pigs and so on? And I wonder, it's kind of, in a way, I think this is why Kenneth and animal welfare people tend to sort of get a little bit upset about the fact that engineering standards maybe don't always hold. So I wonder at what point we actually do say, I recognize it's very expensive to design a new dog facility or a new pig facility, and it may be that that's not justifiable, but how do we make those decisions? And I think they ought to be decided based upon the evidence of what the dog needs as opposed to the single housing maybe. But I'd welcome comments from all the panel members because it doesn't only apply to pigs and dogs, it applies to rodents, it applies to wherever the science is kind of a little bit inconvenient for the housing that's available at the time.
I'll be brief. I really like this question. In a nutshell, you have captured the angst with which the council deliberates on issues such as this. I think just by happenstance, we picked circumstances that involve social housing as a real key priority. It could have been a lot of different things. I wouldn't dare suggest that this one institution that took a very local approach to establishing the best housing conditions for their dogs would apply to another institution or another scenario. In fact, I would suggest it probably doesn't. That's why we say site-specific. So to globalize the unique circumstances of one institution across the entire profession would be inappropriate, we think. So I want to make sure that I don't want to leave you with the impression that we imply to do that. So I think the engineering standard, in this case cage space, is a starting point and it is a critical factor. But as this institution that I was talking about quickly understood that it was only a factor and that there were other factors at play in this particular circumstance that were really just as important as the square footage, if you will, of the cage size itself. Cage size and limited resources alone are not a justification for housing animals in too dense a circumstance. I also want to make sure that ALAC is very clear on that point. But we recognize that sometimes there are unique circumstances in which a broader consideration, other than just the pure engineering approach, is more appropriate for the dogs in the science, or the animals in the science.
Thanks, John. And I really don't have a lot to add other than what you just said, except that it is a consideration of that group of individuals I talked about at the local level, the IACUC, the veterinary staff, the husbandry staff, everyone caring for those animals, seeing the animals, has that opportunity to evaluate them and to weigh in whether or not they think that that housing space is too small or that they don't like to see that animal individually housed. And to move that forward into a written standard or a global standard, I don't know, that's one of the hot topics that our field has, is we don't know how to, we don't know how. We haven't been able to take these individual assessments at each institution and roll that up into a standard that is anything more than just the engineering standards. I think that's something that's going to come forward out of meetings like this and out of future deliberations. We try and put some of that together to come up with something that helps to address that issue.
I also think there's an opportunity to be really creative and think about the species themselves. And is there something you could do to add like a bench or a new little, the pit bull house in the middle of their pen that allows more space for the animals to interact with their environment, gives them control as to whether they're interacting or not. You could just add a flat doghouse that they could jump up on and then have a hiding place inside that could be tossed in the cage wash. And I've tried that, and I think there's a lot of ways we can be really creative about entertaining and making our animals' environment interesting.
One final comment on the question, because I think you really hit on an important point. In the scenario I talked about with the dogs, we judged that the institution essentially had done a proper job of due diligence. They had done their homework. They had made an intentional decision based on their data about the best way to house the dogs. So the ALAC Council said they have done what an IACUC should do. The authority and responsibility for making those careful decisions in the U.S. rests with the IACUC. So the council said they did it. If their answer to our question is, why do you house these juveniles in these cages, had been anything less clear than what it was, we likely would have had a real concern about that. If they had not articulated a careful approach, a thoughtful approach, an analysis of what they had done and why they thought it worked, we would have had a concern and said, it looks like you just haven't thought this through. You need to go back and think about animal density in these cages. So it depends on whether or not we see an issue and how thorough their answer is. But in this case, we thought the IACUC really answered the mail.
And if you don't mind, I've got one quick point to make on that. I think it's a wonderful example, the question of, especially John's example of the cage, of that dog project, the hypothetical thing, actually kind of rolls into the wildlife world. The wildlife stuff is kind of continuously operating in a world somewhat devoid of engineering standard. And each and every project is judged kind of on its individual case. And in the case of John's example, where the research team had to come up with sufficient justification for why they were deviating from the engineering standard, that was the norm on an IACUC dealing with wildlife, because there were no clear-cut engineering standards for procedures from one species or project to the next. So PIs and research teams justifying why they were doing, how they were doing it, was more the norm. So I would like to see kind of that incorporation into more of a wildlife, but I don't know if set engineering standards are going to be somewhat a big future in wildlife. But anyway.
I just wanted to make one comment, which is there's an assumption that the engineering standard is correct, which I would question. What is the level of precision of that standard? That it becomes a line in the sand that absolutely cannot be traversed. I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's something for consideration.
Steve Nemi, Harvard University. Just to follow on Neil's point, and then I'll ask my question. Most, if not all, of the engineering standards used to be practice standards before they became engineering standards. And so to what level of arbitrary or judgment elements did they have before they became codified? So whether they're wrong or right, I'm concerned that we're creating a higher bar for anything different than what we've been doing for decades. And so that's a risk. Question I have for ALAC, and John, and you may want to answer this with a question. Want to make sure that I heard this correctly. If an institution has adopted a change from the guide globally within their walls, I applaud ALAC's insistence on rigor for the reason behind that change was adopted. But did I hear you say that all of the data and the analysis have to be internally originated and driven for such a change? And does that not allow one institution to adopt what they claim or perceive to be an identical alternative from another institution or from the peer-reviewed literature?
Yes, with one caveat. Yes, internal data is something the council has stuck with over time. So that, and that's been challenged within the council, is why do we insist on that? This is not trivial, it's onerous. And let's face it, what we're doing at our institution is very similar to the institution down the street. Why do we have to repeat this exercise? The caveat is, if indeed what you are analyzing at your institution is identical to somewhere else or another location, you could convince yourself, most importantly, and perhaps ALAC when we come, that it is identical and that data really does shed light on your practice. So if you've done that analysis and said, yeah, it really is the same cage, same products, same bedding, same animals, same HVAC system, all the factors that might go into affecting the outcome, ALAC would say, okay, yeah, we'll agree that the outside data may indeed apply within your institution. We find that in practice that seldom occurs. So for all intents and purposes, it for most of the time ends up being an institution-specific data-driven approach.
So that leads me to my final point, concern or enlightenment that maybe the phrase performance standard is an oxymoron. And we should maybe be talking about performance options, because a standard implies universality or more than one intramural option. And if that's not the case, are we, again, using more animals than we need to reprove something that in professional judgment would be good enough? Or are we delaying progress because the bar is just too high? That's a rhetorical question.
Stephen, I have to add to that. When John was talking about that scenario, I was thinking to myself, what would happen if that institution had gone to their IACUC and said, we want an amendment for this cage space, and the IACUC said, sure, okay, we see you want to keep the litters together, and they didn't do the research, and the IACUC's rationale for that was really based on 3 Rs.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think that answer is a little, and I'm going to ask for some help from my ALAC colleagues here in the room. I think that the council would say that rationale, while valid, is a little less compelling. We want that decision by the IACUC to be fully informed, careful, and thoughtful, and the IACUC to be able to look us in the eye and say, here's what we did to convince ourselves that this is a good practice. And if it's more of a hypothetical, it's, I think, less compelling, less strong of an argument. Although, who can argue with the concept of the 3 Rs? In this case, they had data to show that they actually improved the 3R concept, which really gave them the moral high ground, I think.
I'd just like to speak to this in one way, which is, I can imagine the interval between the guide publication, as an example, is quite long. And I believe this is the intent of the guide committee, is that as new information becomes available, that in fact, that could become a universal performance standard, depending on what it was. So I could certainly envision, as additional studies become available, they're sufficient, and perhaps they're repeated, that if, in fact, the way we look at things may change, and in fact, it may be a new standard that would be accepted broadly among the community.
Kathy Liss, Animal Welfare Institute, and I'll be brief so we can get out of here. One is, as you were assessing a couple different ways of keeping the dogs, I wondered if there was a backup plan if neither of the groups was doing well. Or do you carry that out to the end, or might there be an opportunity somewhere along the line to do differently?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And so I think had we not come up with a outcome that was satisfying to us, our next step is actually what we're doing anyway, and that is to characterize what good exercise looks like from the behavioral standpoint. And then looking at, again, going back to what is the outcome we're looking for. So here's the outcome we're going for. How are we going to get there? We didn't get there with option A and B. So what are the other options that we have to meet that exercise standard? And I think I would just encourage us all not to put ourselves in boxes and to think creatively about what do we know about what meets dogs' well-being and apply it. So if we hadn't found the right combination, we would have gone back to the drawing board. We would not have invested in the space, and we would have, again, looked at what is the outcome we're trying to get to and how do we go there. And it would probably involve behavioral studies.
And I was actually speaking of the other group of dogs, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I think part of it is
I'm so enthusiastic.
and part of it is I think what you're saying, if you start looking just at space, it's how you're making good use of the space. It's not turning to allow decisions about, gee, you have to sacrifice social housing or you have to sacrifice space, but making sure that you're really doing the best across the board. Ending on a good note, I just want to say how nice it was to hear about recognition for the emphasis and importance and value of social housing, and that I wonder how each of your institutions and within your roles, you weigh the extreme importance of social housing versus other aspects, whether it's cage size,
I'm sorry
money,
to
et
hog
cetera.
this conversation, but I can tell you that the behaviors that were involved with our program put social housing as the highest priority for dogs. And other behaviors that have come into our organization regarding primates had the same opinion.
Well, the guide, the 8th edition of the guide really emphasizes this topic in particular. And it's been, well, how many hours in total has the council discussed the issue of social housing in one context or another? I can tell you it's a very complex issue. And in some ways, let's take rabbits. Our approach has been, as a scientific community, or laboratory animal community, been challenged by our own naivete. What does appropriate social grouping of rabbits look like? I think the answer is, well, we're not real sure at this point. We don't know the answer to some of these questions. Should we try to socially group compatible animals? Of course. But it is a complex and challenging issue, and one that will take time. We did not get to compatible groups of adult male rhesus monkeys overnight. We now realize that we can do this in certain situations and occasions. That was through trial and error and moving the ball down the path over time. And I think with some of these species and challenges, it will be a similar timeline as we learn more. So I like your comment about social housing. It's dead on, but this is a very complex issue. And whether or not it's good depends on your definition of good, because social housing is not free of conflict and other things that might occur.
I think from my perspective, the example I gave with the 5 pigs, and do you house them 2-2-1 or 2 and 3? For years at my institution, the industry as a whole, we would have housed everything 2 pigs, and 1 pig, because that was priority. Everything had to match. And more I see people rethinking it and going to making social housing or group housing, say, higher on the priority list, to where you do end up with fewer animals that are individually housed. You know, when you have to make a choice of what guideline do I follow or which guideline do I kind of ignore, you see social housing being more and more at the top of that list now. And so that is changing.
Not seeing any more questions. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists, and I'm going to turn the podium back over to Dr. Kurtz.
All right, so I want to thank not only our speakers this afternoon, but all of our speakers today. I think they did a great job in hopefully kind of educating us on all the different stakeholders and where they stand in this process. With that, we'll conclude today. Tomorrow is going to be a busy day for everybody, so I hope everybody's going to come back because this is where we put the rubber to the road and put you to work in developing a performance standard. And the goal is not that we come out of there with a perfect performance standard, but the goal is that we better understand the process, and that's what we're shooting for. So I want to thank everybody again, both here and online, and we hope to see everybody here tomorrow. Thank you.